Oh, where do you write? Hilariously, just answer that question. Yeah, I write on the move. I write everywhere that I can. Hi, I'm Maame Blue. I'm the author of The Rest of You, published by Verve Books and released in February 2025. The book tells the story of Whitney. She's a 30-year-old masseuse. She lives in London. And one day she has a kind of traumatic event that triggers a body memory of something that happened in her childhood. She doesn't know what it is, but she's very in touch with her body because she's a masseuse. So she kind of feels it in herself. So we have a lot of her talking to friends and family over a period of time trying to discover what this is. And then there's a dual timeline narrative that takes place in Ghana in the mid 90s, where Whitney is a kind of toddler, and there's three women taking care of her two aunts and their house help. And something happens that impacts her life later on as an adult. So you're watching these two kind of timelines and how they converge and interact with each other. I actually had this idea while I was in Melbourne it was like January 2020. I just had this idea of this young woman in a club dancing, and she kind of surrounded by people, but she feels completely alone. And that's how the book opens. And I just had this, and it kind of carried on from there. I think it stems from my work as a psychotherapist many years ago, working one on one with clients who've experienced trauma. And I have been thinking probably about a story about what happens in the recovery period. And that's kind of where the seed was kind of planted, I would say, from that point. To be honest, and this is kind of advice I give, but I'm usually writing for a younger version of myself or a current version of myself. Uh, a lot of my characters are, well, not all, but a lot of my characters have like a Ghanaian British heritage, which is my heritage. Uh, I kind of write what I know. And I think I'm kind of thinking of the kind of books I would have wanted to see when I was maybe a bit younger, even when I was in my 20s, seeing more representation of the kind of characters that feel familiar to me or feel like people that are my family members or friends. I kind of, that's kind of what I keep in mind, I think, if I'm ever thinking of a target audience at all, which that only comes right at the end. Yeah. So there's a large element in the book that focuses on the fact that she has a lot of gaps in her history and her childhood. She was kind of born and spent the first 3 years of her life in Ghana, but she has no memory of it. And the only person that really knows about it is the woman that ends up raising her, which is her auntie, Ma Gloria. But she's not very forthcoming with the information. And I think a big thing that I've heard from readers in the UK when it came out is about how they felt connected with this idea of being a child of immigrants and how there are so many things you don't know about your parents and guardians that took place before you were born in that kind of uh, journey of migrating from their home country to another country to more often than not give their children a better life. And so one of the things I hope people will take from this is more encouragement, I guess, to communicate a bit more with elders where possible, obviously, because a lot of that can really bridge the gap in your identity, especially if you're a child of immigrants. This is my second book. My first novel was called Bad Love, published in the UK by Jacaranda Books, and it's very different. It's kind of coming of age romance ish. There's a lot of relationships in it, but I wouldn't say it was romance. But it's a lot more coming of age and like a younger protagonist in her kind of very very early 20s. How she navigates one relationship that is unsuccessful and how it impacts the next relationship that she's in, and what that means to how she grows in herself as time goes on. So it's very different, a lot more lighthearted, I would say, but yeah, really fun to write. I am currently a full-time writer, precariously, as is just the way I am. But I teach a lot creative writing for lots of organisations in the UK and quite a few here in Australia. And I do like editing. Basically, the life of a writer is. I would love it to be like you just sit down and I'm just writing all day. No, that's not how it goes. I'm a kind of project manager in my life at the same time, but technically it's all related to writing, so it's good. No special pen. Although I do. Most recently, I got a remarkable pad, and I don't know if you know what this, but essentially, it looks a lot like a e-reader, but it's just either people use it for drawing or writing. But it's like it's not. It's connected to Wi-Fi in that you can send something to yourself. That's it. It doesn't do anything else but the writing. It's really nice, and you can write as if it's writing in a notebook. And so I really thrive on being able to use different modes in order to write, and especially in editing. And it's like changed my writing life completely in just not being distracted by, oh, I've got 25 tabs open. Let me just check this thing. Like there's none of that. It's just you're here to write. That's it. Um, so that's one thing that I kind of do more recently. I write better in the mornings, and I discovered between book one and book two that I actually write better on the move. So I realized my first novel, Bad Love, which I was just kind of writing, and I happened to be traveling at the same time. I was in Australia at one point. I was in New York. I don't know, I was going to Paris. I was like always on the move. So I was just writing in my little notebooks, and it just flowed. Second book, we were in the pandemic, we were in lockdown. I was just at home, I wasn't moving, I wasn't going anywhere, no one was. And eventually, when the lockdown lifted for a brief period of time in London, I went to an event and somebody asked me, basically asked, how's the second book going? And I was like, it's not, it's very slow. And they asked me what worked with the first one. And I realized, like, oh, I was on the move, I was moving. So then when I could get on a train or a bus or a plane, or just I'm going somewhere else, immediately the writing comes. There's something about the movement which really helps me. So I think there's definitely not one way in which to kind of get a story out. So I will definitely be like writing bits and pieces throughout the day. I don't have like a block of time. I'm just sitting and doing this. But if it's the first thing I can start my day with, that helps me for the rest of the day, definitely. Oh, where do you write? Hilariously, just answer that question. Yeah, I write on the move. I write everywhere that I can. I'm also like not wedded to one specific place or way to write. So I will have a notebook. I'll have this remarkable pad that I talked about. I have my phone. I also use Google Docs a lot, and I can do that kind of depends on what I'm working on. But yeah, I'm not limited, which is really nice. I also find, especially when you're starting out, you kind of like you have a set idea of like I need to be in this space to be able to write in X way. And of course, creativity and ideas don't really work like that. They come when they want to come. So I'm always like, just have something to write with, even if it's a napkin. And I remember when I was starting out, not even starting, I was working full time and in a different role, working as a psychotherapist, working as a project manager. And there would just be scribbles of poetry on the sides of my books because I would write on anything. If it came, then I'm just writing. And it was later on very valuable. So, yeah. Truth tellers, I would say. Uh, which is that's a very weighty responsibility, I think, on writers. But I think that's probably always been our responsibility, from my opinion. Um, whether it's truth in fiction, non-fiction, but something about the truth of the human experience, I think, is more relevant now than it ever was. And writers are kind of like perfectly placed in which to put some of that out into the world because especially because we're all just inundated with all kinds of misinformation and disinformation and nonsense. I think there is something for me, something very stable about a book that you can't argue with the words that are printed. You can, but they stay printed, they stay there, and I think there's something quite everlasting about it. So yeah, I would say truth is one of the things. I like speculative fiction. I like a kind of dystopian. I was just reading Octavia E. Butler, and I'm just kind of reading a lot of Toni Morrison at the moment. I like really human, very like character driven stories. I am a big fan of those. Yeah, and I also just love poetry. So it just varies. It just depends. Most of the time, I'm gravitating towards a really strong, complicated character. I quite like that. So from my memory, first author that sent me on my reading journey, Jacqueline Wilson. Um, she had this series called Girls. It was like Bad Girls or Girls Out Late, or something. And they were like, I think they were like preteens, uh, and it was just these friends, and they just reminded me of my friends, and they were, they cared about like boys, and they cared about like looking cool, or like, but I mean, all of her books deals with like real kind of the anxieties and insecurities that come with just adolescence in a really just like perfect way. So as an adolescent, those are the books I like. Oh, I loved. I read those like so many times. Um, and again, it was very much about the characters and what was happening in their lives. Writing, oh, so many, but one I do remember before I wrote Bad Love, I was reading um, Elena Ferrante's My Brilliant Friend, and the Neapolitan novels, which are the four novels in that series. I ended up like reading them all, and I was just like blown away by. I'd never read anything written like that before, where the narrator is so strong, and she's talking about lots of other people. It's all about how she views the world, and it's less about her and more about how other people are kind of in and out of her kind of view. But I like just the casual way in which she wrote. Like it felt very conversational, and I was really inspired by that because I was like, oh, it doesn't have to be prim and proper and like kind of how we were classical like taught at school, like you have to write like this. Actually there's lots of different ways to do things, and I don't know, that kind of inspired me to keep going with this little story that I had that ended up becoming Bad Love. So those are my two, I would say. I'm sure it was a really silly story for my friends at school when I was like 10. I do remember, but I remember the first thing I ever wrote that I wrote for at school, and my teacher was like, "That was amazing," and I was like, "Oh," like I was really, yeah, like excited. I think I wrote. It was the task was to write. They gave us like a opening line or something, and then write a story. I must have been like 7 or 8, and I wrote a story about camping in the back garden. I don't know. That's kind of all I can remember. But I just remember her being like, "This is really good. Like you've done. This is amazing. Like well done." And I've just felt really like, "Oh, just so proud of myself." And that's probably a like core memory that stayed. I'm working on something. The next thing. It's very early. It's very different to the first two books. It's a much bigger story, and it's I'm writing it in a very different way because usually I start with character, and then the story kind of unfolds around them. And this time the story started, and the characters came later. So it's kind of like, oh, this is different. So I'm working on that without being too vague about it. Thanks for having me.